recording. So here it goes. All right. Hello. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our third special chapter meeting, which we host each quarter on a climate-related topic presented by honored guest speakers who share their expertise and experience with us. I am Ava Sani. I serve as chair of the Climate Reality Project, Philadelphia and Southeastern Pennsylvania chapter. It is my honor and pleasure to host this evening's special presentation on the topic of microplastics in the Great Lakes. Thank you all for being here tonight. We're excited to have friends and fellow climate reality leaders joining us from across our country and over the border in Canada. Please introduce yourselves in the chat, your name, city, and state and country, and tell us which sister chapter or allied organization you're a member of, and anything else you'd like to share with us tonight. So before we get started, please note that this meeting is being recorded. We have reserved 90 minutes for this evening's presentation and Q&A discussion, and we will adjourn at or before 8:30 p.m. I'd also like to draw your attention to a few Zoom features, which we will use to try to create a more interactive discussion. So first, during the presentation, please post your questions in the chat. We will collate and reserve those for the Q&A session, which we will open after the presentation. And second, please locate the emojis and raised hand features on the bottom of your Zoom window, which you may use during the Q&A session. We will also enable you to unmute yourselves to ask a question at that time once we get to the Q&A session. So let's get started. I'd like to welcome everyone again to this evening's special presentation on the topic of microplastics in the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes contain the largest body of fresh water on Earth, and they represent 1/5 of the freshwater surface on the planet, which is about 6 quadrillion gallons. The Great Lakes are also called the nation's 4th seacoast. They are located on the US and the Canadian border and span across 8 states, which are Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, New York, and Pennsylvania. The Great Lakes Basin is home to over 30 million people and 3,500 species of plants and animals, including more than 170 species of fish. But right now, the Great Lakes are also home to microplastics. Microplastics in the Great Lakes is a water quality problem that has a high potential of impacting human health and the aquatic environment, not just within the Great Lakes ecology, but also downstream through the numerous tributaries that connect the Great Lakes and run through adjacent states like ours. So to tell us more about all of this, tonight it is my great honor and pleasure to introduce our special guest speaker, Arthur Hirsch. Arthur is a former environmental consultant with over 30 years of experience. He lives in Boulder, Colorado, and spends his summers in Pentwater, Michigan. He is originally from Michigan, and he received his Bachelor of Science degree from Michigan State University and a Master of Science degree from the University of Colorado. His expertise is in the area of water quality, stormwater management, sustainability, climate change, and environmental impact assessments. He has been a Climate Reality Project member for 3 years and joined its leadership core in 2021. Arthur is currently working on several issues. One is the Enbridge Line 5 shutdown and environmental impact statement. Another is greenhouse gas reductions associated with transportation, oil, and gas operations in Colorado. And also, as you may all know by now, microplastic pollution in the Great Lakes. So this evening, Arthur will discuss the microplastic types, sources, impacts, legislation, and local and regional mitigation actions. So welcome, Arthur, and now I will turn it over to you.
Okay. Oh, great. Thanks a lot for that very nice introduction. I really appreciate it. And thanks to all of you for attending this presentation. I know that your time is valuable, especially in the evening. And so I really appreciate you coming to the talk and talk about this, I think, a very important problem in regards to microplastics and plastics within the Great Lakes area. Microplastics, it really isn't on people's radar that much in terms of federal and state agencies. And that's one of the challenges I'm having, is putting it on their radar. Microplastics is an emerging water quality pollutant, and it's been known to impact both the human and aquatic environments. So, so with that, let's get going. Okay, let's get the slide. So before I start, make an acknowledgement. I want to acknowledge that we in the Great Lakes occupied ancestral, traditional, and contemporary land formerly and currently held by numerous indigenous individuals, tribes, communities, and nations who historically were forced from their homelands. Offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm indigenous sovereignty, and we will work to hold ourselves more accountable to the needs of the American Indians and the indigenous people. So thank you for that. So microplastics, here's what I'm going to be talking about. Just a quick overview of what microplastics are in terms of the problem. I'm going to be talking about sources, pathways, extent. I'm going to be talking about data gaps that are occurring within microplastics. And ultimately, what can we do to start addressing the problem with microplastics? And so, my overall goal for this presentation is for you to become better aware, educated, concerned, and willing to take action in terms of addressing this problem. So I'm going to be repeating myself, I think, during this presentation. So I just give you a heads up. It's a theme. One, it's complex. It's complex. It's complex. This is not an easy issue to solve. Second thing is it represents a real risk to the environment, both human and aquatic, by known laboratory and field studies that have actually been done on the Great Lakes. There are data gaps that need to be filled by research, especially in the impacts area. And there's a need for precautionary action. And I'm going to talk about that later on in my presentation, about really what precautionary action really is. So you've heard a little bit about introduction about the Great Lakes anyway. I'm originally from the state of Michigan. I lived my summers right about here. I grew up here. So a lot of my time, my life has been on the shores of Lake Michigan. It's just been a really great place as a kid to grow up with a lot of time on the beach, a lot of sailing, fishing, etc. So it's just been a wonderful place to grow up. And as I get older, I'm seeing more and more impacts associated with the Great Lakes. And it's not being necessarily treated with respect as much as it should be in regards to really for the Great Lakes area. So this is just kind of a real simple map, just kind of show you the states that are around the Great Lakes. We have Wisconsin, Minnesota, we have the Province of Ontario, and then we start getting into the New York, a bit of Pennsylvania here, Ohio, Indiana, over in this area here, and then we got Illinois, Chicago area, and of course the Great Lakes state of Lake Michigan. So this kind of gives you a sense of the bordering states for the Great Lakes and the systems that I'm going to be talking about. So what I've been noticing, I'm 70 years old, and these are the abuses that I have seen, I said, growing up on Lake Michigan and in my lifetime. I've just seen, especially Lake Michigan, a lot of abuse of the Great Lakes, from direct discharge of raw sewage in the early parts of the Clean Water Act, industrial discharges, phosphorus and detergents, algae blooms, which is a huge, huge problem now, especially in Lake Erie. Invasive species, various types of mussels, zooplankton, different new types of species, combined sewer overflows, potential carp introduction. We've got a thing called PFAS, perfluoroalkyl substances. They're causing a real problem in Lake Michigan and the Great Lakes, not only in the water, but also in the biota. And then we get into plastics and microplastics, which are considered an emerging pollutant in the Great Lakes. So think about plastics and water. Maybe this is one of the first things they think of. They think of those big ocean dump sites that occur in the various parts of the Pacific. And there's 5 basic gyres along the Earth. And these are basically rotational circulation patterns of water accumulate garbage coming from various countries and continents throughout the world. So, okay, we get this basically circular pattern of water that accumulates these bottles, plastics, etc. However, the Great Lakes don't have these huge gyres, but they do have a circulation pattern that tends to distribute plastic materials. So on the bottom right, these are basically the high loading areas of trash, plastic trash locations here in the Great Lakes. And you can see here in the bottom part of Lake Michigan here, there's a lot of metropolitan area here from Milwaukee, you got Chicago, Gary, along this whole area here. You see a lot of plastic loading around by Detroit, over in Cleveland, this area here about Lake Erie, and then Lake Ontario with Ontario, Canada being a major polluter. So it kind of gives you a sense of the loading that occurs. And here's the circulation patterns that occur also. So like here at Lake Michigan, you can see there's not a whole lot of distribution of water that comes from the top to the bottom. It's kind of almost like a closed system here. And so that's why you see a lot of plastic accumulation here. One of the things I will notice, you can see the circulation patterns here. It basically goes in almost in a counterclockwise way in terms of most of these lakes. So, so then it has its own distribution pattern. And one of the things that doesn't go in these big circular areas accumulate plastic. So what the circulation patterns as they are in the Great Lakes, a lot of the plastic ends up on the shoreline instead of just staying out on the water. So it's really deposited along the shorelines of the Great Lakes. So plastic, it's complex. It's complex, and one of the things I'm going to talk about with the plastics issue is, it's really integrated into the supply chain. Plastic. It's extremely difficult to get away from plastics. And so one of the themes I want to present here in this presentation is I'm not anti-plastic. My quality of life is associated with plastics because I have no choice, because that's just kind of how the supply chains have been structured for the past 20, 30, 40, 50 years. But what I am concerned about is the presence of many plastics in the environment that's indicative of our throwaway society and how poorly we're really managing these plastics. And so these pictures here really show the plastic demand in terms of why are plastics manufactured? How are they used? First one is containers, single-use bags. That's the #1 use of plastics. The second is PVC piping, various types of piping for construction purpose. But one of the things that I was really surprised on, the #3 reason why there's plastics is because of clothes, synthetic clothes. And I'm going to talk a lot about that. Next is basically general plastic that we use from medical applications to toys, to various types of things that we use, like pencils, papers, that sort of stuff. Again, kind of those ubiquitous sort of plastic materials that have a whole laundry list of items. Then we start getting into the transportation area. Then we get into the electronics, and then finally manufacturing, used for various types of insulators, ball bearings, etc. So this is really the major area that plastic is used in our environment, how we are integrated and intertwined in this whole plastic situation. So these are the most common plastics that are out there. And it's a whole laundry list. The reason I highlighted the plastics in the yellow is these are the primarily ones that we see in the aquatic environment. It's causing a lot of that trash material in the Great Lakes. High density polypropylene, milk jugs, trash bags, shampoo bottles, low density, probably many of you know these already. Bottles, food wrap, polyester, polyethylene terephthalate with water bottles and fibers. Then we get into polypropylene and polystyrene, which we all are very familiar with, egg cartons and takeout food cartons and stuff like that. So this is just kind of give you a laundry list, and there's literally hundreds of different types of plastics that are out there. So this is a really interesting slide, is because it shows you this is the accumulative amount of trash of plastic generation that's going to be occurring from 1950 to 2050. So this is the curve of basically manufacturing of plastic. And you can see one of the things that's really scary is you can see this huge, the slope of this graph of actual manufacturing of plastics is huge. It really shows no sign of leveling off by any means. We're expected to increase the usage of plastics 2 to 3-fold by 2030. And you can see how much it's going to go up by 2050. So plastics, we're not going to be able to recycle our way out of this. This is a real potential problem. We can't handle the plastics that are being generated now in 2020 in terms of being able to recycle them. We only have a 9 to 10% of people recycling. So one of the things is that it's occurring now is the oil and gas industry has invested close to $400 billion in the next 5 years to invest in virgin plastics. That means coming directly from oil and gas and not necessarily not recycling. To give you an example, Shell Oil Company is going to be putting in an ethane cracker, which is really the foundation of the plastics. 1.6 million tons of plastic per year will be generated at that site in Ohio. And they got a $1.6 billion tax credit for putting that manufacturing facility in there. So this is a real problem. And like I said, 10% recycled, 12% of the plastics underneath this graph is incinerated, 60% is landfilled, 15% end up in the environment. So, I mean, I could talk all day about this graph, but at least you got a sense of the fact is that, we're not going to get out of this plastic problem in the very near future. Another thing about plastics is, what are they made of? And when I was a kid, I used to burn plastic, and I remember the horrible smell of experimenting with doing that. And it's nasty stuff. And the chemicals that are toxic are associated with plastics. Many of them are endocrine disruptors. And I'm sure many of you know what those are. And they basically affect our reproduction capability, damage our fertility, and even our unborn children. So this kind of gives you a laundry list of some of the main plastic. And so it's a problem. And it was an interesting statistic that I saw in the paper a while ago, that 30%, there's been a fertility decrease of 30% in males over the past 35 years. Basically, their sperm counts. So Is it associated with plastics materials or other types of chemicals that we get introduced to in our environment? So a little bit of food of thought of how much plastic is out there in the environment and our exposure. I needed to talk about this just a little bit. I needed to talk about plastic manufacturing. It is a huge, huge industry that emits a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. And I didn't want to talk a whole lot about it, but otherwise I wanted to identify the fact that this is an environmental issue, environmental justice issue. Basically, a lot of these manufacturing facilities are located in very poor towns. And you can see 90% of the plastic manufacturing emissions occur in 18 counties in the United States. So primarily they're down in Texas and they're down in Louisiana. So this is a real problem also in terms of the emissions, the Cancer Alley issue that's occurring in Louisiana and in Texas. And there needs to be something needs to be done about this. Okay, moving on to the Great Lakes. Let's talk about plastic loading just a little bit. With the Great Lakes, 22 million pounds of plastic go into the Great Lakes every year, 22 million. And Lake Michigan is number one, followed by Lake Erie, Lake Ontario, Huron, and Lake Superior. So again, you got kind of a sense of who the leading areas are in terms of the plastic. 80% of the litter found on the beaches, as we walk along the beaches, 80% is plastic. So that's the problem. So let's get into about what microplastics are. I think those of us who go to the beach, we've seen this. We've seen this type of stuff in this photograph in the hand. It's plastics that are less than 3/16 of an inch. They're less than 5 millimeters. And there's two types of microplastics. The first one is called primary. And the primary microplastics are those that are actually manufactured on purpose to be less than 3/16 of an inch. And there's various types of applications. One is called plastic pellet nurdles. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. Microbeads in cosmetics and toothpaste. And also there's industrial applications for microplastics, they're called microbeads, to remove paint, rust, etc. So again, less than 3/16 of an inch. But then we get into the secondary type microplastics. And those are the ones where it's from really large pieces of plastic or larger pieces of plastic that have basically been degraded from larger to smaller pieces. So they've been degraded by UV, the sun, weathering, wave erosion, abrasion, etc. It keeps grinding down into smaller and smaller sizes, ultimately getting into 3/16 of an inch or less. Microfibers in synthetic clothes kind of fit into this particular area also. Then we can get into another smaller scale, and these are in nano. I think this is close to 10 to the -6 in terms of millimeters. So it's extremely, extremely, extremely small. You can't see it with your naked eye. However, these are the most toxic forms of plastics because they end up a lot of times into the tissue of fish and even into us. Okay, so now you got a sense of the plastics. You've seen them before. There's five basic types. What are the fragments? Basically breaking down bottles, piping, etc. And then we start getting into these pellets. Again, like these nurdle type things that are precursors to the plastic manufacturing. Then we get into film. And this is from like potato chip bags, really thin type of, I think there's even like refreshments type containers. They've got these very, very thin materials, and they're plastic. Styrofoam, we're all pretty much familiar with styrofoam and how bad that is. And then we start getting into fibers or microfibers. So those are the main things. And one of the things I do want to talk about real quick is each one of these the toxicity and distribution of the microplastics in the Great Lakes is really a function of their weight, the density, the surface area. And so it's very complex about trying to figure out what toxicity a certain type of fragment may have or type of microplastic may have. Another thing is these areas have large surface areas. And so what happens is that the material that plastic is made out of that I talk about, the endocrine disruptors, what will happen is once they're in the water, once they start getting into the water, they'll basically leach the chemicals out of the plastic and into the water. Conversely, these areas are primed for adsorption. So a lot of heavy metals and toxic materials, such as herbicides, pesticides, PCBs, are attracted to these sites. And so that's an important problem in terms of the toxicity with the microplastics. So what's the distribution of these microplastics that I just showed you? So in this area here, this is in the Great Lakes. So this is like in the open water area, okay? And fragments, plastic fragments are really the dominant type of plastic that is in the actual open water. This is data that comes from the USGS and the University of Sedona. So again, fragments are dominant. But as you get into tributaries that discharge into the Great Lakes, the dominant type of microplastics are microfibers. And you can see quite a bit in the mid 70s in this particular field study. So again, there's a little bit different locations and spatial distribution of various types of microplastics that will occur. So what does it look like? What are the concentrations of microplastics in the Great Lakes? And this is a snapshot. This is from Dr. Mason in 2014 from New York, but it kind of gives you a sense of the distribution of microplastics. So let's start over here at Lake Michigan. We're seeing about 17,000 particles per kilometer squared. So you can get a sense of at least the numbers here. Lake Superior, which is really surprising, has it's higher in microplastics than Lake Michigan and even Lake Huron. And so I asked the question, why? Why is this so high? Because there's not much industry on Lake Superior. Well, the reason being is Lake Superior is so big and it's so deep and the flows are so low that plastic from aerial deposition is really the main source of this plastic in Lake Superior. And as you see, as you go further on down the chain here of the lakes, start getting into Lake Erie, start getting to 46,000, and then all of a sudden, Lake Ontario with 230,000. So it's almost like the plastics in some sort of way. They're just kind of flowing down, ultimately into Lake Ontario at the back end of the Great Lakes. So the next part of this talk is going to be sources. What are the sources? And then I'm going to be talking about pathways. What I mean by pathways is how does the microplastics get from point A, the source, to point B, which is the lake. So some really interesting stuff kind of comes out of this is that tires, automobile tires is the #1 source of microplastics in California, especially in the urban areas. And that makes sense, right? There's a lot of cars, there's a lot of people. What happens is these fibers, material from the rubber in a tire come off loose. They end up on the pavement, and then you get a storm event, and it goes into the storm drain. So it's the #1 problem in California. Textiles. This is probably the biggest problem in regards to sources, the clothes that we wear. And it really kind of bummed me out when I started doing this research because I have a lot of synthetic clothes because I ski, I run, I kayak, and a lot of my material that I wear is synthetic. So it kind of bummed me out. So microplastics from washing, just machine washing, 700,000 fibers per load from a clothes washer. The detergents that we use to wash our clothes, 178,000 microbeads per mil. That's really a concentrated amount of micro beads and microfibers. And then obviously drying our clothes. Again, that's another source of microfibers and microplastics that we see in the environment. Here's a graph that shows the production of synthetic clothes, primarily polyester, which is the dominant type of synthetic clothes. Again, it's not leveling off at all. I mean, there's a huge demand for polyester type clothes, where you can see where the cottons and the wools are staying pretty steady. And that's where we need to really start concentrating our efforts in the future, is more of the natural fibers. Another source, single-use packaging. I mean, a lot of you know this already. You know, the bottles. Now, this is a picture of bottles that I think it's somewhere in Vietnam or Malaysia, where the United States generates all this plastic material in bottles and pipes, etc. And basically, we can't deal with it or won't deal with it. We ship it overseas. China won't deal with it. So now we dump it on countries like Malaysia and Vietnam, and they struggle, even in India, and they struggle managing it. And we also on the bottom right, you can see the various types of packaging of our foods, our vegetables, etc. Again, this is a major source of microplastics. Now, here's some interesting information about potential sources, and I never would have thought about this. For those of you who understand wastewater treatment facilities, there's such a thing as called sludge. Sludge comes out of the wastewater treatment facility that basically cleans up our sanitary sewer systems, the things that we flush down the toilet. They get treated, they get so they can be discharged into the waters of the US. But what comes out of this is sludge. And another word for sludge is biosolids. And biosolids is used by agriculture for soil augmentation and also for fertilizer. And what's happening? Close to about 50 to 60% of all the municipalities in the United States, they get rid of their sludge on agricultural properties. The problem is that these things are loaded with microplastics. What happens during the storm event is that these will basically discharge into the waters of the United States through runoff. Even in agriculture, they use mulches for specialized crops, strawberries, chilies, etc. Not very many times are these mulch materials really recycled. It's almost impossible. A lot of times they're burned, or they're just left to basically degrade. Even fertilizer that's used in our plants, that like corn, soybeans, etc., they're encapsulated with plastic. Even the seeds are. So plastic, again, is everywhere in the agricultural realm. So the thing that got me started in the plastics area was this type of visual. Like I mentioned, I live on the shores of Lake Michigan in the summertime, and I came out and I was walking the beach, and all of a sudden I saw this wave of all these plastic pellet materials coming onto the shore. And I go, what in the hell are these things? I had no idea. Then I started researching and finding out that they are nurdles. And basically the nurdles come from plastic manufacturing production. They come from fossil fuels. Fossil fuels make these small little cylindrical bodies here. And these are the precursors for the plastic manufacture. So basically what happens is they're heated up and they go into some sort of jet molding, based upon the various types of plastic you're trying to manufacture. And that's, so again, these are the things that are causing a lot of the problems in the Great Lakes. Because once they get out, they're buoyant and they end up starting to disperse quite easily onto the shorelines of Lake Michigan and the Great Lakes. Other sources of microplastics, toothpaste, who would have thought, right? Polyethylene, polypropylene, beads that are in our toothpaste. I mentioned the detergents before, and then we have industrial cleaning operations are another source of microbeads using to remove paint and rust. Okay, let's go over some pathways now. How does it get into the waters of the US or on our beaches? Wastewater treatment systems is one mechanism, going from our sanitary sewer systems and even storm sewer systems that basically these wastewater treatment plants collect the water, treat it, and ultimately discharge it into tributaries or directly into lakes. Then we talked about, again, industrial discharges, about using microbeads primarily into the waters. A huge pathway are stormwater. Just pretty much like what I showed you before from the tires. This is the #1 problem in regards to the pathway in the Bay Area, is the amount of trash that's just basically collected from the streets and ultimately end up into the gutters and ultimately into the waters of the United States, the Great Lakes. So here's what I was talking about before with agriculture, and this is your typical, what they call non-point source pollution. And this is a problem with nutrients in the Great Lakes, primarily Lake Erie, which has a huge nitrogen and phosphorus problem. But then again, you've got these microplastics that I showed you that ultimately get entrained in this water from stormwater and ultimately get discharged into the waters of the Great Lakes. These are just an example. These are called combined sewer overflows, in which both the sanitary sewer systems and the storm sewer systems are collected together and treated. Sometimes what happens, you get these huge storm events, like in Milwaukee, where basically they can't contain the sewage or storm the material anymore. And all that waste goes directly discharged, in this example, into Lake Michigan. So in this particular example, 380 million gallons were discharged into Lake Michigan. And you can imagine just all the microplastics and other types of chemicals and materials that were discharged into the lake. Another pathway is beach litter. Butts, darn plastic Tipperillo tips. This is what I feel like that I'm doing in for my summer mornings, is picking up trash on the lake. The thing that really surprised me, as I was talking to representatives from the United States Geological Survey about this, the study that they did in Utah State, was the enormous amount of plastics that is in the air that ultimately gets deposited onto the land surface. 1,000 tons of microplastics, the equivalent of 300 plastic bottles, settle on 11 Western National Park wilderness areas of about 1 million acres. That's a huge amount of microplastics. And this will kind of give you a sense of what that looks like in terms of the settled, deposited microplastics. So one of the concerns that we've got in Colorado is when these things get deposited on the snow, they have what they call a different albedo. In other words, they absorb the light differently than snow, and they're more adept to absorbing it. And so what happens is things get heated up. And so the question in Colorado is, will the absorption of light promote higher melting rates of our snowpack, which is really important in terms of managing drinking water and even ski areas for that matter. So this was a real eye-opener. So instead of sources and pathways, I'm going to talk a little bit about impacts. And this is where most of the data gaps occur. You know, what is the cause and effect relationship? What is the tipping point? At what concentration does a microfiber or a microplastic cause an adverse effect? And that way you can establish a standard. Right now, we're not there, but we know that there are potential human impacts and ecological impacts. I think some of the most important one is the amount of grams of plastic we absorb as human beings in North America. We take in 5 grams of plastic a week, each of us. And that's the weight of a credit card. And so we get this plastic from the air we breathe, from the water we drink, and the food that we eat. And that is surprising. Finding microplastics in the placentas going across the placental wall. Infant fecal concentrations are greater than adult. So why is there more plastic in babies than there are adults? Well, is it because of the plastic bottles that they're feeding from with the milk from the mother? That's a real question and important. Now we're finding in Great Britain and in Scandinavia, they were doing some studies and they found out that now microplastics are moving about in our blood system. It's deeper in our lungs than we ever expected. And again, we're getting into issues of potential endocrine disruption and fertility. So that's the human aspect of it. And now the ecological impacts is, again, these microplastics absorb a lot of heavy metals, a lot of toxic materials. They're mistaken by fish for food, and they're ingested by fish. A lot of times they're not able to excrete them out, and they stay within the fish themselves and ultimately starve them. Also, at a cellular level, there's shown this. A lot of inflammation occurs from laboratory studies. And obviously the problem we're concerned about is the food chain. Is this the food chain? And it shows that it has a very high probability of doing it. Because here, this picture here is this is plankton. I mean, this is the baseline of our food, of the food web. And what's this highly green area, that is microplastics. That is basically a microfibers that has been absorbed, taken in by the plankton. So this is really scary stuff in terms of where this is going in terms of the food chain and how it affects the ecology in our human health. So again, I'm repeating myself, I know, but more research really needs to be done to understand what these tipping points are. And these are just an example of a fish that has mistaken these nurdles as food. So let's talk a little bit about controls. And again, I could spend all day talking about a lot of this stuff. But I just want to give you an idea that there are things that we can do and have been doing. But a lot of people think, well, we can just clean it up. You know, it's in the lakes, we can clean it up. No, you can't. Once it's been released into the environment, you can't get it back. A lot of it's a lot of sedimentation, or it's just dispersed over a wide area. This stuff is so small, you just can't filter this stuff back out of the water. So the thing is source control. There's things that we could do agriculturally in terms of doing some alternative practices of managing runoff. Industrial controls, and these are no-brainers, right? Improve stormwater management, stop littering on beaches, improve wastewater treatment facilities. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And do source control. Stop using plastics as we have and disposing of them in a very non-environmental fashion. So this is the wastewater treatment plan. And I guess really I want to just basically say that in a lot of facilities, these are treatment plants are pretty efficient in terms of removing microplastics. So they get a 90% removal of microplastics in wastewater treatment plants. The thing is that you need to get to that 90, you have to have tertiary treatment. And not all wastewater treatment plants have got tertiary treatment. And it's expensive to put in. So this is so it's good news, bad news. I mean, it's 90% removal, but there's millions of gallons that flow through a wastewater treatment plant a day. So there's still significant loading that occurs of microplastics into the environment. So a little bit more level here in terms of controls, what we can do possibly at home or as consumers. And one of the things that that a lot of manufacturers are looking at, clothing manufacturers, is synthetic material substitution in terms of addressing the microfibers. And Patagonia has been doing a lot of research on this to try to look at different types of materials and fibers that do not shed or shed as much during the washing cycle. So we're looking at natural fibers, cotton, wood materials, even hemp that they're looking at. Again, these are the things that we could look at as being consumers of the types of materials that we buy. Next are washing machines. And washing machines are going to start getting into having integrated filter systems. This is something that California is being proposed right now, and also in the United Kingdom. And so you can see these types of machines where they have a basket here that collects the microplastics from an internal filter system, or you can get another type of filter system now that basically you can put on the side of your machine. So these are pretty efficient. They remove about 90% of the microplastics that come from the washing machines. So again, I want to give you a snapshot that there is something that we can do and may be forced to do regulatorily in regards to dealing with controlling these microplastics. So how to control them? Another way is through regulation. And one of the things that California did is they took what I call a precautionary management approach. Basically, they didn't understand the tipping points that I was talking about, the concentrations that cause an impact and an effect. However, the state of California realized that plastics, especially, have a potential toxic effect on human and animals from the various types of compounds and chemicals that are used to manufacture plastics. So they basically said, we're going to basically identify those nurdles, the little cylindrical plastic materials. We're going to call them a pollutant, and we are going to manage them under the Clean Water Act. So this was the only law that has been done so far in terms of starting to manage nurdles, plastic materials. And Governor Schwarzenegger, back in 2007, basically signed that bill. Only bill in the
Arthur, I think your screen froze. Your audio froze a little bit, if you can hear me.
Okay, you're still with me. Okay, I lost it.
Okay,
Hold on, I'll just go back to share.
sure.
Okay, here we go. And so California, again, is taking this precautionary management approach. Just recently, in 2018, of actually starting to monitor and evaluate risk associated with microplastics on human beings from drinking water and also the biota. So they've got standardized methods of how to measure it, monitoring it, and being able to manage it. This is a really progressive program that I hope that a lot of states would pick up on. So Senator Durbin from Illinois proposed the Plastic Free Waters Act. Again, trying to control these plastic nurdles from getting onto the shores of Lake Michigan primarily, but also the entire Great Lakes. And so he came up with this Free Waters Act to control the nurdles. And so it's still pending, but it's very doubtful that it's going to see the light of day right now. But it's out there, and a potential approach in the next legislative session in regards to managing plastics in the environment. The last one I'm going to talk about is called the Break Free from Plastics Pollution Act. And this is a very huge, broad plastic control law that's being proposed by Senator Murphy and Representative Lowenthal. But it deals with trying to get away from toxic materials and plastics, trying to promote better recycling, holding companies responsible, paying municipalities for managing their waste that they generate. In other words, recycling, and having them paid for. Looking at different ways of recycling and requirements of having certain types of materials required. Reducing pollution, again, from the plastic manufacturing. So this gives you just a snapshot of this. And again, there's a lot of it in terms of trying to control microplastics at the same time within this bill. So big picture recommendations. And these are just things that I came up with, other people that I've talked to, but develop a monitoring program and methodologies, being able to measure microplastics. There's not a consistent way of measuring them. Compare it from one place to the other. Between scientific researchers and political leaders. No idea what's going on in regards to plastic and microplastics. Promote public knowledge and awareness, which is, I guess, what we're doing right now. Expand risk analysis at the ecological and human level. Understanding what those tipping points are that cause a toxic effect. Initiate precautionary management that I talked about, the California approach. Promote source reduction and controls. Improve stormwater management. So these are just some of the big picture recommendations, but us as bringing it down to a lower level, like you and I, what can we? Well, first of all, one of the things we can do is really know the political candidate's position about the environment and even about microplastics. Who are these candidates and what do they know? What do they represent? Contact representatives to support and co-sponsor bills. And that's really what I'm doing right now in the state of Michigan, is trying to get them to co-sponsor bills like Senator Durbin's bill for the Great Lakes. Initiate precautionary management bills. Again, I'm repeating myself. Source control through federal and state regulation. Stop the use of single-use plastics. Modify our personal decisions about how we buy stuff as consumers. Do we need to buy as much plastic? Are there choices of how we buy the materials? Fiber, I talked about the fiber filters. Synthetic versus natural fibers. Laundry detergent, looking at different types of laundry detergents. Promoting outreach and education on plastics. Teaching our kids about microplastics and really understanding, so they understand really the importance of the environment and the types of plastics that they get involved with and hopefully can manage. I think my biggest takeaway almost is recognize the fact that we cannot recycle our way out of this problem. The microplastics and plastic generation is huge. So another thing you can do is you can join the Climate Reality Project Microplastics campaign. And by all means, you can feel free to contact me. Here's my contact information, my phone number, my email address. And so, contact me if you want to get involved. with protecting the Great Lakes, especially as it relates to microplastics. So with that, I guess I'm ready for any types of questions or thoughts that you've got about microplastics. Oops, I lost you. There we go. Are you hearing me?
I am hearing you. Do you want
Okay.
to unshare your screen? And thank you so much, Arthur. That was a very informative and eye-opening presentation. Definitely lots to talk about. So we look forward to your participation in the Q&A session, which we will start now. And Margarita and I have been collecting the questions in the chat. So
Thank you.
Margarita, do you want to start us off with the first questions?
Okay. Make sure I find. First of all, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, good. Okay. One of the people who submitted a question about what resolution we would have if we want to look forward, say, 10 years from now. And we're looking currently at the kind of pollution we have in the atmosphere and in the environment and in the waters. What should we do now that would have the best result if we look forward 10 years in the future in terms of our having fixed the problem?
I'm sorry, did they want me to project on what it's going to take or what the problem is going to be? Can you restate the question, please?
Yeah, if you're going to be looking back 10 years from now, looking back to the present, okay? If you're going to think about what should we do in the present, that if we're 10 years in the future looking back, we would have thought it would have made the best effect on our situation.
Okay, I got a sense of it. Well, what are we going to do now? You know, yeah. I guess, again, I think it's how we manage the plastics. You know, it would be great to get the recycling increased, improved, where actually people recycle, you know, only 9% people recycle. You know, so it just needs to be better management of plastic materials. And I think what is really key, which would really help, other than people making smart choices about what they buy, is really requiring the manufacturers of plastics to start picking up the tab of cleaning up the plastics, you know, funding recycling programs at municipalities, because right now, plastic companies basically push the liability and responsibility of plastic management onto us as the consumers. And they say it's your problem because you buy our stuff. And the thing is that we're looking at it much differently. We should be, is that they should start paying for picking up and manage plastics that they're manufacturing and causing the environmental issue. So I think those are two main things. I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff, but I think those are the main issues that we need to look back. We would look back and say, you know, this is what we should have done, or this is what we did to improve the issue. I hope I answered the question.
There's another issue circulating around, though. Petrochemical companies are now faced with the possibility that we're not going to be using their chemicals to produce gasoline and to produce ethanol and methane and things like that. So they're changing their business model to produce more plastics. Namely, they're trying to open plastics factories. I mean, in West Virginia, Western Pennsylvania, and Ohio, right now, there are half dozen of these factories either ready to open or in line to open, in terms of the factories are being put together. I mean, so this seems like counterintuitive to me, because no matter what we do to fix the problem present, if we have these companies who are basing their business model on producing more plastics, you know, I think we have a problem here.
Yeah, and I agree. And so where's the environmental ethic then? I mean, from us and our legislators, Why are they allowing this to happen? Why are they allowing them the permits to build this thing in the first place? Why are they allowing them permits for their air pollution discharges, which are huge? That's exactly what's happening, is because they see that oil and gas, for vehicle transportation is going to be down. And so that's why they are pushing more and more plastic manufacturing, because they have to increase that profit margin and maintain that profit margin. So it's really like, what are our legislators doing? What are we doing to really try to stop them manufacturing? Like, why was Shell given a tax break of $1.6 billion with this plastic facility in? So you have to make some people accountable for the decisions that they're making.
Mhm.
I felt like I was on a soapbox there. I'm sorry.
That was a good answer. So one of our chapter members has asked, what do you know about microplastics that come from plastics recycling operations?
Yeah, not much. That's not a major source area. I think the only thing that microplastics related to recycling would be is if it got into the storm drains or something like that. I'm just not seeing, or I've been aware of much research where that's really identified as a major source of microplastics.
Mhm. Okay. And Melissa was asking in the chat, what does one do? I mean, you went through a bunch of things that we could do, but really everything's, we see a lot of plastic in the grocery store. It's everywhere. Where do we start?
So it starts by activism. Have you gone to the grocery store? Do you go to a Kroger and basically voiced your opinion? Why are you doing what you're doing? Especially like Kroger's and other grocery stores, they say how sustainable they are, and they're recycling their materials, and you really have to watch out in many respects of the greenwashing that's occurring, because, they're throwing plastic on us what we really don't need or want. And that's the issue. And it just like, I go to the grocery store, why is my vegetables wrapped in plastic? It really doesn't need to be that way. And so, you basically have to become an activist, an advocate, and say, this is unacceptable, or I'm going to go someplace else. I'm going to go to a farmer's market. So a lot of times the choices are on us in terms of what we do. The second thing is that be an activist, get pissed about it and start doing something about it, and start pushing of what we can do to stop the plastic from occurring, and being so integrated in our lives. So I don't know if I answered that question really good, but at least I give it my best shot.
Mhm. Right. We have to start where we are in our environment, where we go, think about what we do, where are the sources of plastics in our lives, and
Right,
how.
right. And we get used to it. Us as Americans, we're a throwaway society. We go to the store, we buy a bottle of water, and we throw it away. How long do we use it? Maybe for like 3 or 4 minutes, and we throw it away. Again, that's the problem of the throwaway society that we've become, is that, like a garbage, like a bag. I've gone to like a drugstore, and there's a person in front of me. He's got 2 candy bars, and the cashier says, can I put that in a plastic bag for you? And he goes, well, yeah, okay, you can do that. That's like, I feel like, what are you doing?
Yeah, it's like,
So again, it's recognizing who we are. It's almost, I have seen the enemy, and it is us. I can't remember what cartoon that came from, but yeah, I mean, it's us too.
It's also the habits that we I guess we have, but it's more than that. I think it's what we've become accustomed to, and the norms in the society, that this is the way it's been, this is the way we operate. And I don't think we have thought enough about changing that paradigm, well, this, and just asking those very questions that
Right.
you were mentioning.
Right. And now things are hitting the fan. Now we're starting to feel, it's starting to become a problem. Before it would be diluted, we weren't aware of it, but now we're aware of it.
Mhm.
And now it's a whole different thing now, in terms of really what our lifestyle needs to be, because we know that it's out there and it's going to be affecting us, or it has affected us already.
Right. And so it's taking that awareness one step further by helping people understand what are some tangible steps that they can actually take. So how to advocate, how to, talk to your legislators, what petitions to sign, what are the bills that are out there, which
Right.
I wanted to talk to you about in a second. But Sydney had asked the question about the California ordinance. The California ordinance was ratified in the 2007. So what's been the result of that?
Yeah, I think it's been successful. If I'm talking to people in California, I think that what they're trying to do is they've increased that strategy. And I talked about that strategy document in 2018. So they basically built off of that NERDL law and improved it to make it much more encompassing to not only drinking water, but also the surface water and the ecological resources. So it's been successful. Yeah.
Okay. So are the Great Lakes connected through their tributaries, or are the Great Lakes connected? I've heard that they are, that all the Great Lakes are connected.
Yes, they are. Oh, yeah.
Through the tributaries, right? So how does this?
The headwaters of Lake Superior branch at the Mackinac Straits, either into Lake Huron or Lake Michigan. And then from Lake Huron, it goes down to the Detroit River, ultimately into Lake Erie, and then into Lake Ontario. So yeah, they're all connected.
Mhm. And how does this affect then the distribution of the microplastic? I think you froze, Arthur, your screen just froze.
May take him a minute to recover.
Okay.
Arthur? This is called a glitchy internet connection. At least it didn't happen to any great extent during his presentation. There were only a few tiny stutters.
Okay,
He'll
he
come
might
back
be
on.
trying to
Yeah.
log back on. Okay.
Yeah, he'll come
So
back on.
does anyone else have any questions? I had a couple more, but if you want to put those in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourselves, there you are, Art.
Yeah.
I'm back. I think I got a really bad signal, so I'm sorry.
Yeah.
About
No, it's no problem. We understand, and glad you could jump back on. So I was asking about the tributaries. I was kind of intrigued by that whole system, because my question is, how does this affect the distribution when you consider the way the lakes themselves individually have their own distinctive circulation patterns, and
Yeah.
how does that
well, one of the things that is affects microplastics in terms of the types of microplastics and the quantity of them, or you can look at, if you talk about tributaries, I'm thinking of a watershed. If you look at it in terms of a watershed approach, if you've got one that's urbanized, that has a different microplastic characteristic. If you're looking at an urban area versus an agricultural area or a forest area. So the tributaries are really important because they really drive the character and loading of the microplastics into the water. If that helps.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And can you, Art, can you tell us a little bit more about the microplastics campaign that you are leading, and particularly about those two bills that Senator Durbin has introduced, the plastic-free Waters Act and the Break Free from Plastics Act.
Yeah. Well, things that I'm doing is I've been in contact with the Senator Durbin's office, the environmental lead on this. And my mission has been trying to get state senators from neighboring states of the Great Lakes, from Michigan, Illinois, Wisconsin. Those are the primary people that I've tried to hit so far. And basically say, would you co-sponsor that bill? Because the Durbin bill has only got 2 co-sponsors. And there's no House of Representative co-sponsors. So that's really my major emphasis right away has been that, trying to get Senator Peters and Stabenow from Michigan to basically commit to co-sponsoring the bill as it exists right now in a future bill in the next legislative session, which I think Senator Durbin's going to propose. In regards to breaking free from plastics, yeah, that's an all-encompassing bill that we're trying to educate a lot of people on. And it goes, I'm aware of it, and I get involved with it a little bit, but it's mostly a macro plastic management issue as opposed to microplastics.
Arthur, I think you froze again for us.
He'll come back.
Yeah. All right. Does anyone have any more questions while Arthur is getting back on? You can raise your hand.
There's something in chat. Okay. Okay.
And so and the other thing that I'm trying to do is, again, it's more of that preemptive approach, that pre-management approach that I talked about with California, developing strategy documents. Even though you haven't got everything totally figured out, start developing a system such that you can identify microplastics, monitor it, evaluate the risks, and actually start really fully managing it to protect the environment and the human health. So that's I think just trying to work with the state is important. And I wanted to bring up a point, is that, I brought up some ideas of what we can do as people, just common people like you and I, what can we do? We put filters on our washing machines, and we do source control because we watch the type of products that we buy or the clothes that we buy. So those are the things, and those are important. Those are really important to do that. However, where we get the most bang for the buck is legislative. Then your people are forced to do it. Either they like it or they don't, but it's really the best way, in my opinion, to start addressing this microplastic problem is through at a state level and also at a federal level, similar to what Senator Durbin's done, and then also Governor Gavin has done in California. So there's 2 levels of things that really have to happen, in my opinion.
Okay.
Okay.
And I see that Sydney has his hand up.
Yeah. Sydney?
Am I unmuted?
Yes. Yes.
Okay,
Sydney.
great. Well, thank you, everybody. I have my own soapbox, which I will not stand on this evening, because thank you, Dr. Hirsch, for an excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Covers a great deal of ground, but I think that the plastic issue, the microplastic issue, is only a subset of the larger plastics issue. And in Pennsylvania, where many of us live, the problem is we have a very large petrochemical industry, which, as Dr. Hirsch pointed out, is recognizing that we are going to move away eventually from fossil fuels for heating and transportation, and they are looking for alternative ways to dispose of their product to make a profit. So, for example, there's the notorious ethane cracker out in West Pennsylvania somewhere or other, which is designed to take the stuff that can't be burned or used in fuels to generate plastics. And but to the point about what can individuals do, first of all, let me go back and say one of the issues that we need to address at the legislative level, which is very hard to do, is what's been done in parts of Europe, which is this idea of cradle to grave responsibility for the products that companies produce, which Doc, you can comment on in a second. I'm sure you know all about that. But the other thing that we can do is, as individuals, each of us can play, a tiny, minuscule, microscopic part in doing our part to reject plastic. Don't get plastic bags. Wherever you go, do not get a plastic bag. Reject them wherever you can. It's not going to make a difference in the grand scheme of things, but if all of us did that, it would help. And if all of us bought recycled what we can, which does not include plastic, as I think Dr. Hirsch knows very well. There, plastic recycling is a scam. So, but to put it mildly, so I think each of us in our own lives can minimize our consumption of plastic. Don't buy bottled water. Don't buy things in plastic bottles if you can buy glass, which of course has its own carbon footprint. That's a separate problem. But for plastics, which are going to be around forever, I think the key thing is we have to limit the scope of the overall production, try and get some kind of accountability at the producer level. Maybe you put a tax on anything that contains plastic. It can be used to support environmental remediation activities and so on. But of course, at a legislative level, getting that past Congress in any state or jurisdiction is, shall I say, difficult.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for that comment. And I agree with everything you said. And you mentioned the word accountability. Accountability of the various stages of a life cycle. And ultimately somebody's got to pay. You manufacture it. Somebody has to pay. And paying in certain ways. You pay it with your health. You pay it with the environment, or you pay with money. So. It's extremely difficult, but I think you're right on. People have to understand the life cycle aspect of this, in realizing, plastic comes from fossil fuels, and there's a whole stepwise process of getting it out of the ground, ultimately manufacturing it, transporting it, disposing of it in some sort of a fashion. So it's some sort of hopefully some sort of circularity to it. As much as possible. So accountability is a big problem, and who's going to be held responsible? Thanks, Sydney, for those comments.
Do we have any more questions, Arthur, tonight?
If I may, one of the things one can do, I sit on my township's environmental advisory committee, and we've been pushing for a while to get a plastic bag ban in place in our township, as several of our neighboring townships have done. And that is getting close to implementation soon, which means that retail establishments will no longer be allowed to provide these so-called free plastic bags, which are nothing of the kind. Mm-hmm. And anyone who gets an alternative bag, paper or whatever, is going to have to pay a certain amount, a small fee, 5, 10, 15 cents for each one. The idea being that to encourage people to bring their own bags, just like the people used to do in the old days when they had shopping baskets. Not that I want to go back to those days, but those were people didn't have plastics. But I also want to make another point, which I put in the chat as well. There are some areas where plastics are really, really not, if not indispensable, at least very, very hard to replace. There are lots of areas in the medical field, for example, which is mine. And in terms of keeping food fresh, in its transportation. That's a big one because food wastage is a terrible contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. I've done some blogs and publications on that. So plastic has its uses, but it's got to be used appropriately and with ideally the cradle to grave responsibility of the producer.
Yeah. Couple things. Yeah, and I've seen the argument of why they have to have plastic over vegetables. Well, I can transport it much further. It can come from Chile, or it can come from New Mexico, or something like that, where before you couldn't do that. Well, yeah, okay, so you're using plastic to basically, be able to preserve the vegetable. Why don't we grow it locally? We're gonna have to change how we purchase our food also. We don't need to have everything from Chile or Uruguay or China. We need to start changing some food in this country, using it at a local level where we can get away from this plastic stuff. Another thing that I wanted to mention is you mentioned I'm sorry?
We don't need to have strawberries in December.
And also, you talk about the single bag use, the fee. The companies in some states have basically gotten into the legislature and saying you cannot pass laws to prevent plastics from being used. You can't stop us. It's called the ban. And so, and it's surprising. One of the things. So basically, if you're in a community and say, I want to stop single-use bans, they're going to say, can't do it. We can charge people a fee or a tax to using those bags, but you can't stop them. And so we've been lucky in Colorado that it's called ban the ban. Basically, those constraints are no longer there. So we can tell people to basically shut it off with the plastic bags. So, and we did that. One of the things that has happened last legislative session is that Colorado banned single-use bags. That's going to take a while. It's going to take 3 years to take into effect. Also, styrofoam is also is basically going to be banned. And so it can be done. You just have to have the right legislature who will listen to your story and basically try to push the agenda at a state level.
Philadelphia County has a single-use plastic bag ban. It went into effect a while back. I go to the grocery store. I always keep 2 rolled up cloth grocery bags in my handbag. Either fill one or both of them. I get a 10-cent credit for bringing my own bag. If I didn't have that bag, they would charge me 10 cents and give me a paper grocery bag.
Right.
It works fine.
Right. And in my opinion, if you're going to be using a plastic bag, they should charge you a quarter or 50 cents to make it a little painful. But then again, it's what they call it, regressive, sort of a tax, so they'll be kind of seen that way. So, it'll be more of a hit on people, low income people than other people. So, but yeah, those are the options that we've got. And I'm really bad at forgetting my canvas bags when I go to the grocery store. So I get all my food in the cart. I'm getting to the checkout, and it's like, oh, I left them in the car. So I pull the cart off and put it in an aisle, go to the car, get the bags, and then I forget what aisle I put my cart in. So, but anyway, I really try. And that's all we can do is you can't get away from the plastic. And so I guess if there's a moral to the story, is do what you can to try to stop it, because it's really difficult to stop it.
But I think you also hit on a key point that the legislative, strategy is very important. And we find that that's the case with almost all of the climate-related issues, is changing the legislative policies and rules.
Right.
So with that, I see that we're close to 8:30, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. But it's been really a wonderful evening. Thank you so much to our distinguished guest speaker, Arthur Hirsch, for joining us to share his great work, wealth of experience and insights to help us understand the importance of protecting our Great Lakes and how the problem of microplastics affects us all. Arthur, thank you so much for your informative presentation on the types of microplastics, the sources, impacts, legislation, and local and regional mitigation actions. And also, I'd like to thank everyone from our sister chapters, our allied organizations, and our chapter here in the greater Philadelphia area for your contributions to our discussion this evening.
You've been a very wonderful audience, and I appreciate you coming. And the only thing, last word, if I may, is come join me. Come join my campaign, and let's see if we can make some things happen. Okay.
All right, that sounds great. And so our next steps after this meeting, we'll be sending the registrations, the link to the recording and to additional resources and references, including Arthur's contact information. And so, yes, thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for attending our special chapter meeting this evening. And I wish you all a very good night. And please let us know if you have any other questions on this topic, and we'll be happy to forward them to Arthur. So thank you all. Good night.
Bye. I have a quick question.